several times. President has limited power. And, you know, whether it's a dude that you like or dude that you don't like, they get a lot of blame for stuff. A lot of times it's out of their control. There are good presidents who have helped the nation, and there are certainly bad presidents that have made things worse. The presidents before Abraham Lincoln certainly made things worse. I think it was Franklin Pierce and Buchanan, maybe, that came before Lincoln. Not good presidents, because they allowed us to slide into civil war. And of course, along the way, you know, opinions vary on everybody since then. Lincoln himself was not a popular president in his day. We read a couple of weeks ago in social studies about the Gettysburg Address, which happened after the Battle of Gettysburg. There was a memorial ceremony there. And we read, you know, one sort of glowing, very complimentary letter to him about his speech. And then we see in the press, you know, he got sort of beat up about how short it was, and it didn't really memorialize or honor the soldiers that died there. And that was, people were kind of hot or cold on Abraham Lincoln. You went one way or the other. He was he was a great orator as far as speech writing. His speeches were really well written and moving. He had a horrible voice, apparently, like as far as a speaking voice goes. He was kind of hard to listen to. He was kind of nasally. And, you know, he wasn't much to look at, let's be honest. So that, you know, sort of added to the idea. And of course, when he became president, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Once they knew Lincoln becoming president, he was an abolitionist. He wanted to see the end of slavery. That's when the southern states started to secede with South Carolina, and then a bunch followed after that. So then, after the war, the Confederacy surrenders more or less, and now we have to figure out, okay, well, we have these war-torn states. Just like in any war, there's destruction. There has to be some reconciliation. There has to be some means of coming back together, particularly when you're talking about civil war. You know, two sides can continue to disagree when there's other countries, but we have to, you know, bring ourselves back together, and we have to rebuild, because that's going to mean a lot for the health and well-being for the entire country, not just for the North or not just for the South. We need to come back together. So the era of Reconstruction then, if my slides will slide. I don't know why it doesn't want to advance sometimes. Let's try this. There we go. Which is a period that starts at the end of the Civil War in 1865 and continues to 1877. It was incomplete. It was halted and did not finish. And it's my opinion, and a lot of historians' opinions, that incomplete nature of Reconstruction is why we continue to experience some of the issues that we have today, namely things like racism, namely, ideas about states' rights. And we'll talk a little bit, how do we get here from there? So we'll start first with the 13th Amendment. So the Emancipation Proclamation, as I mentioned, basically the way to look at it is it changed the status of slaves to free. It didn't do basically anything else. And we also know, as an executive order signed by the president of the North in the Union, it did pretty much nothing to actually free the slaves that were in the Confederacy. But it was an attempt to undermine the economy of the South during the war. And also, once those areas were liberated, once your Union armies came through, those slaves also, as part of that executive order, were allowed to be recruited by the U.S. Army, or the Union Army, I guess I should say. Now, the 13th Amendment, which started, Lincoln started the work on the 13th Amendment before he was assassinated, just right after the end of the Civil War. This amendment made slavery illegal in the country. You can no longer own slaves. That is outlawed. It is abolished. So that is basically the root of the 13th Amendment. And it's part of several amendments that are going to come along the way that are focused at civil rights, aimed largely at that population that had been enslaved, right? So the 13th Amendment is the first. Now, slavery is abolished state to state. We had mentioned that Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware remained in the Union, although they were slave-owning states. So it doesn't apply to them anymore. Across the board, slavery is going to be illegal every inch of the country. Now, I mentioned, the devastation of war. And this type of war was rarely seen. There's certainly been wars before the Civil War where we saw more death and a lot of destruction, but rarely had it been seen like this. And the overwhelming majority of that destruction occurs in the South. That is where most of the war occurred. So there has to be some help there to rebuild. And I think the picture that I have there is of Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital, right? And you could see just there, that is a war-torn city. And there was plenty of those all the way through the South. And not just the cities themselves, not just buildings, but part of Sherman and Grant's way of fighting was to destroy the rail lines. They would literally just pull up rail lines so Confederate rail cars could not, travel and move goods to, city to city, state to state. Bridges, of course, were destroyed, blown up, and roads were destroyed too. So there's an infrastructure problem in the South. Let's be honest about infrastructure in general in the United States at this time is pretty weak, but particularly in the South after this. Farms and plantations, as I mentioned, they burned their way through a lot of the South. So they destroyed stuff after they foraged and took crops. Sherman was a savage when it came to war, but he knew what it took to win, and it was going to mean demoralizing the Southern population, the Confederates. So all of this needs to be rebuilt, reconstructed. The other problem here is the labor force. Over 1/4 of the white population was killed during the war. So all of these young men that went to fight for the Confederacy didn't come back. So about 1/4 of working age Southerners were dead. The other problem here too is the way that units were mustered, the way they actually organized their companies and platoons and all of their structure. So you serve next to your neighbor, you serve with your brother or your father. There are always small communities. So you can imagine if your unit was in a really bad battle and got wiped out, that entire community would lose its young men. So, not just with, labor, but actually, rebuilding and repopulating the South is going to be a problem as well. This actually, occurred in the North as well, but because there's less devastation, it's not as much of an issue, and some units were organized differently. But in the South, they were all sort of local communities. So you get wiped out and you have, a whole community of widows and not a very large workforce that can help rebuild. What we also have here is the introduction of sharecropping. So now you have a free population that had been slaves. It's a large population, and they also need work, and they need to earn a living. Well, what they know how to do, their skill set is farming. It's mostly agriculture. There are certainly, plenty with certain trades and things like that, but the slaves who were recently freed, a large portion of them are going to turn around and wind up working the same land that they were a slave on. So the idea was plantation owners then paid, well, they weren't able to pay because, again, the destruction, the loss of money during the war, a lot of these plantation owners are close to broke. So it introduces this idea of tenant farming. So those same slaves, or those former slaves, are now working that land. And just like the name implies, sharecropping. So the workers get a portion of the crops, and then basically to pay for their rent of that land, they share their crops and their materials with the former plantation owner. Now, this might remember the first day we started the history, we were talking about feudalism and manorialism and serfs, right? These people that work the land for their duke or count or lord. It has a very similar feel to it, and it winds up being a continued way to continue to sort of oppress and subjugate the new free population, because the plantation owners, still being the landowner, gets to sort of set the rate as far as how much of the crop that they're going to take, basically the tax that these people are going to pay. So nobody's getting rich sharecropping, but it is a start as far as that, moving from a large population of enslaved people who can't just, there's no mobility there. You can't just get up and leave yet. You have no capital. You can't move, and your skill set is still based in agriculture. We read a piece about from Frederick Douglass prior to the war that he wrote in, it was 1852 or 1853 for a July 4th celebration, where he's damning sort of his northern allies that they're doing nothing about slavery. So, of course, he's still a central figure after the war when it comes to the continued promotion of civil rights for this African-American community now. But he also tells them, it's not going to change for us overnight. And we're going to have to do the things that we've always done for some time until we can, lift ourselves up. What we also have is continued growth in urban areas. Okay, so, still more movement. Now we're going to start seeing a slow, this is going to happen later. We talked about that Great Migration, but we're seeing sort of that slow climb or slow movement towards cities. That industrialization that's occurring in the north is going to start sort of filtering down into the south. So some of those, that farming technology will be more readily available in the south, and things like that. So, and this is also, I think, we mentioned George Washington Carver, who was the Lord of the Peanut, right? He had a million things that you could do with peanuts. He's also, we read something about him. This is applied to sharecroppers who needed to find a way to make money off of land that wasn't growing cotton because it was fallow, right? You couldn't continue to farm that land and continue to plant cotton there because it leaches the nutrients out of the soil. So you have to rotate crops. It's hard to leave just an empty field for a season or two and not make money off of it. So one of the ideas there he had was growing peanuts because it didn't leach the soil the way cotton did. And you then rotate, your peanut crop around as you're moving your cotton crop in. So continuing on. So there's quite a bit of division, not just between the North and the South still, but within the Republican Party. Lincoln had been a big proponent of reconciliation with the former Confederacy, with the Southerners. He wanted to, I don't want to say let bygones be bygones, but he wanted to reintroduce the South to the Union. Now, obviously, at some point, they're going to have to become states again. They're going to have to re-enter the Union. But he wanted to, I don't want to say take a soft hand with the South, but he wanted the North and the South to come back together. There was a set of Republicans, the radical Republicans, that opposed Lincoln's ideas, and Andrew Johnson, right, who became president upon Lincoln's assassination. He was a Democrat. I mentioned he was from the South, but he was loyal to the North. It was one reason that Lincoln picked him as a vice president, because he thought that he could help work with the South. Obviously, that had no real calculation, with the Southerners. So they believed that Johnson was too soft on the South. One reason, because that's where he was from, and he had been a Democrat. And these radical Republicans wanted to really come down hard on the Confederates. They didn't want any of them to serve in legislation or get elected to any official offices after that. They were looking at criminal charges and just really snuffing out those former Confederates who had survived the war, or those former lawmakers who had served with them in Congress. They may have been onto something. I'm not sure that the softer route was possibly the way to go. There's different histories about that. But 3 years later, those radical Republicans attempt to impeach, they impeach Andrew Johnson on these grounds that he's you have to have these very specific sort of charges. And I don't remember exactly what it was that they impeached him on. But the idea largely was that he was too soft on the South, and the radical Republicans were not on board with this idea of reconciliation with the South. There's been 4 impeachments in the history of the United States. Of course, the impeachment is the sort of charges that are brought up against a president. It does not remove them from office. They have to be found guilty of those charges. The impeachment is just the process of attempting to, charge them with a high crime or misdemeanor, as they say. Andrew Johnson was impeached. Bill Clinton was impeached. Donald Trump was impeached, and Donald Trump was impeached. So making history there is the only president to get impeached twice and, lived to see another day after that. In all cases, there has not been a president removed from impeachment proceedings. They have been found, not guilty in the impeachment charges. The only one who likely would have lost and been removed was Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal in the 70s, but he resigned and Gerald Ford took over before he could be impeached. But anyway, continuing on with Reconstruction, there are landmark legislation amendments that are added in this era. July 1868, we get the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to former slaves. Now, Emancipation Proclamation changed slaves from enslaved to free. 13th Amendment abolished slavery, outlawed the practice of slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment then grants full citizenship to former slaves. The 14th Amendment is cited probably most often in Supreme Court cases today because of the language there and because of things concerning due process. and individual rights. Some of the language in there, amendments are very detailed and they go in a lot of depth. And the Supreme Court looks at those amendments to make sure, that whatever is passed in the future is in line with the Constitution. And that's one that's cited quite a bit. With the overturning of Roe versus Wade, there's a lot of fear right now about other potential harm to the rights that are enumerated in the 14th Amendment, or not enumerated in the 14th Amendment. So the other thing probably to mention here is that in order to ratify an amendment is different than just a bill, right? This is actually adding to, you could say sort of to the Bill of Rights. A new amendment must have a 2/3 majority vote from the states. Actually, let me check my math there. I'm pretty sure it's 2/3. Oh, no, I'm sorry, 3/4. So 3/4 of the states, so about 38 states in today's world, would have been different then. It takes 3/4 of the states. So once an amendment is, passed in Congress, was like, okay, we got this bill. We want to make it an amendment, not just an act, not just a new legislation, but a new amendment, right? Because that's the idea in the U.S. Constitution. We amend our rights. It then goes to the states, and it requires 3/4 of those states to pass it. They have to agree on it. They vote on it locally or statewide, and then it comes back and it's made an amendment. So that's why we don't have new amendments every week. That is a very detailed process to do that. And obviously, at this point, it would, unless it was something very evident and obvious, it would be difficult to get an amendment passed with some of the political divide in our country right now. So the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all former slaves. The 15th Amendment, 2 years later, guarantees the right to vote to all citizens. Now, it would seem obvious that with the 14th Amendment, that would have been a done deal. They are citizens now; they should have the right to vote. Unfortunately, in this era, and unfortunately, even in today's world, there's various means to undermine the right to vote. And we'll see some of that here. So there was a lot of resentment coming from the former Confederates, coming from the South towards the North. This idea of the black vote angered many Southerners, and there was this continued oppression of former slaves and African Americans in the South. One other issue, so there was the Freedmen's Bureau that was set up, that was a federal office, and they had locations all around the South to help these former slaves, with some assistance. There wasn't much monetary assistance. They weren't, giving handouts and stuff like that, but, helping with job skills, helping, secure jobs, some relocation, stuff like that. And these Northerners came down from the North to work in the South. They were seen as exploitative, that they were exploiting the South. So the term carpetbaggers, for one, it was this derogatory term for these, Northern bureaucrats and other workers that came to the South because they thought they were, exploiting the South to make a quick buck. And carpetbaggers comes from the style of suitcase that they carried, which was just like a carpet covered bag. So resentment's coming, all around from the South towards the North, whether it's because of new legislation, whether it's because the victory in the war itself, or the new rights that were given to slaves. And then we have the introduction of the Ku Klux Klan in 1871. I believe one of its founders was Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a Confederate general. Their whole mission is white supremacy. They are, twist their Christian philosophy, because this is largely a what they would consider a Christian organization. And they try to overthrow these new Republican state governments. And their other purpose was just largely intimidation of the Black population, but particularly with voter intimidation. So I should mention here as well, so during this period between 1865 and 1877, the Northern Army, the U.S. Army at this point is occupying these states and helping to rebuild and helping to secure them. So there's a lot of American U.S. soldiers in these cities. There have these provisional governments set up, right? So they're not part, or they're part of the United States, but they haven't regained their statehood. And there's these provisional governments set up, and they're largely, obviously, ran by Republicans. And some of those are also from the North, or most of those are from the North. So that's also causing resentment as well, because they haven't basically returned to their former statehood. So we have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. There's still, these knuckleheads that run around. I think every once in a while they have a parade and get out their white hoods and their robes and everything. What sort of survives of the Klan is not really what it was. It had a lot of influence. It was a very secretive organization for obvious reasons, but it was rampant. And with voter intimidation, and just running, freedmen off of land, or just out and out. We see lynchings. There's made up crimes. There's just a horrible amount of violence towards these recently freed men, and subjugating them further under the white Southerners. One other way that is that occurs is through Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws are segregation laws. They're called Jim Crow laws because I believe it's there was an actor who wore blackface, and his name was Jim Crow, and that's where those come from. But there was this very successful movement in the South, and it wasn't just in the South, there's segregation in the North as well, to separate the population, the Black population, from the white population. So there were separate facilities. You've probably seen pictures, you've probably heard stories, seen, things on TV about the era of segregation. There was different schools. There were white schools, there were Black schools, different seating at restaurants, if you had seating available at all, train cars, and then later buses, as we know, if we talk about Rosa Parks in the 1950s, were segregated. So you did not mingle with other races. White and Black were separated. And again, that is a means to suppress that population. Now, moving forward a little bit here, the political cartoon I have there is basically, someone at the a freedman at the ballot box, and there we go. I can't remember. It's hard to see the caption at the bottom, but it's basically saying, yeah, he's going to vote for Democrats or something like that, and intimidating him to vote a certain way. There was other means that they suppressed the black vote. Now, even with some of this, with these attempts, there were successes in the South in this time frame after the 14th Amendment, or excuse me, the 15th Amendment, in electing former slaves and African Americans to Congress. So both in the South, as state legislators and U.S. legislators in this time, there were some successes. There were Republicans that were getting elected there, and that had to do with the help of the black vote. Another way that they suppressed the vote was through things like poll taxes. So, we have free elections. If you are an American citizen, and you've registered to vote, you show up on election day and you vote. Now, you can imagine if you showed up on election day and there's like, okay, that's $100 poll tax, or whatever it would be. But the idea was it was going to be too expensive for the African-American population to vote. They also attempted a literacy test to vote. So because obviously with coming from slavery, your slave population was largely illiterate. There were certainly some that could read, but that was another way to grab, that particular population and pull them out of the voting polls because they couldn't pass a literacy test. Voter suppression is still a thing. It's much more nuanced. It's based on districting and gerrymandering now, and other ways to try to prevent people from voting. And yeah, like I said, it's much more nuanced and masked today, but it's very obvious in some cases what they're trying to do and who they're trying to keep from voting. So moving forward here. So the end of Reconstruction. There is an economic panic in 1873. There's an economic depression. We're going to talk more about the Great Depression next week, which happens in the 1930s, but it gives everybody pause. There's things going on. For one, the price of cotton fell because it was being overproduced. There was too much in the market. So supply and demand kicks in. As demand goes up, prices drop. That was hurting the South. But there's widespread economic issues over all over the United States. And largely by this time with Grant, I believe, as president, the idea is that we need to focus on the economy more so than racial equality and racial political progress. So the era of Reconstruction is basically cut short. It ends in 1877. There's a compromise over the presidential election, and the Democrats, who are Southern, control the state legislature at this point in the House of Representatives. So either way, you're looking at a stalemate, and continuing with lawmaking regarding racial equality and political progress. So Reconstruction comes to an end. And as I mentioned, it is incomplete. It does not solve the social, economic, or cultural problems because of its shortened nature, which is why, to some degree, not all, but for some degree, we still see the Confederate flag today. Why do we see the Confederate flag in Ohio? There's no real reason for it. And other issues surrounding that. So what winds up happening in the South is the promotion of what's known as the lost cause. And it's basically this idea that has been perpetuated that is erroneous, it is wrong, that the Southern war effort and the South's rebellion was noble and just, and that it was about states' rights. There's not a historian worth their weight that's going to say that it was just about states' rights. There's certainly no claim that can be made that it was a noble and just war. But that is why we are still having these discussions about the Civil War. And that is a very difficult hill to climb with a lot of people. And the idea is really based in memory, and the memory that was created about the Southern effort in the war from the time of Reconstruction until right now. So it's something, yes, we have not yet moved past, and unfortunately and sadly, I don't know when we'll be able to move past it, when we'll stop seeing the Confederate flag. Along the way, so as I mentioned, segregation becomes the law of the land as well. Now this happens about 20 years, about 23, well, yeah, a little under 20 years after the end of Reconstruction. But there's continued segregation in the South. There's continuing of these local laws, businesses that separate and segregate the population. And it comes to the Supreme Court in a case known as Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So a year or two before that, there was a gentleman, I believe he was Plessy in this case. He's a black man and he's boarding a train, and he sits in a white car. And he's removed from the train. He sues, I think the case is in Mississippi, and sues the state, and he wins locally, wins his case against the state on being removed from this train car. It then goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decides that if you maintain equal facilities for both races, then there is nothing illegal about segregation. So plain and simple, the idea of the age was separate but equal. That's a problem because it never was equal. Like I mentioned, schools, for example. Well, guess who's going to get the most money for their school and the best funding? Who gets the better facilities? So there was never any real attempt to continue to even attempt to make it equal. It was separate for sure. But this will be revisited in the 1950s. And we'll talk about that when we get down to the 1950s, but it's finally reversed, I think, in 1954 in the case Brown versus Board of Education, which leads to the integration of schools. That one dealt with schools, but it overturned the idea of separate but equal. That was not going to stand as the rule of law in the United States anymore. So that's the South, and as I mentioned, this carries over. It's not just exclusive to the South. A lot of these ideas, there's segregation in the North as well, and obviously it makes life difficult for African Americans to get to vote. There was, a reversal for those next 20 years. We after those immediate successes where they got former slaves elected to Congress, that starts to decline very shortly after the successes. And by the time the 1890s are around, we have very, very few African Americans serving, which will be the case until really the present era. And the continued, subjugation, poor working conditions, poor work opportunities, in which we've talked about. What we'll get to at the, by the turn of the century is this great migration. So Black folks are finally like, you know what, I've had enough. We're getting out of here. We're going to the north. We'll go to a city. We'll find jobs there. So, too far. Let's see if we can get through at least some of the Gilded Age as well. Overlapping with Reconstruction is this era known as the Gilded Age. So, outside of the sort of economic panic in the 1870s, the United States starts to take off economically. As I mentioned a couple times here, we are very safe from invaders and attack from rival countries in this era. Nobody can really touch us. Nobody really wants to. It would cost too much. We're too far away. There goes back to this idea from the 1840s, and it just slipped my mind. The Monroe Doctrine, which basically was this idea. James Monroe, when he was president, was like, nobody's got to mess around in our backyard. That's the extent of it. It's like, we're not going to allow Britain or France or any other European power or anybody else for that matter come and mess around in our hemisphere, in our little side of the world. So there's a lot of progress technologically, economically occurring in the United States. The United States was initially sort of behind the curve when it came to the Industrial Revolution. This is really where we take off in industrializing. A lot of the North had started that process in the 1800s. Some of the European countries were ahead of us in that game. But we complete the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. So we had railway from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. You could hop on a train in New York and eventually make your way to the Pacific coast. Without having to get off and ride a horse or take a carriage or something. You could continuously travel across the railroad, which obviously opens up for more internal trade and economic growth. And so things are going gangbusters. Things are improving, and this is the era where we also start to see mass immigration. This is the era of where the United States becomes the land of opportunity. Most of those immigrants from this period are coming from Europe. There's a lot of Irish and Scottish. That would be, where my people come from, and Northern Europe. Germany sees quite a bit of immigration. Italy, and they're coming here to find jobs. Situations in those countries and certain areas in particular are not good. When they come here, they're not great either, but it's better than what they left in a lot of situations. Unfortunately, what also is growing at this time is wealth disparity. You have the emergence of the sort of ultra rich class. Now, there's always been really stupid rich people in the United States. A lot of them were part of our founding fathers, guys like Thomas Jefferson, really rich. Most of those guys, barring a few, were really rich. But now we're talking about guys like Andrew Carnegie, who was the steel magnate of the day, made his money in steel manufacturing. The Rockefellers that made their money in oil. And I'm not talking about petroleum like today. I'm talking about Standard Oil, which was lighting oil used for lamps. I think later they kind of get into the petroleum industry. But at that time, petroleum was seen as a byproduct of the lamp oil. And it was really volatile, and nobody was really sure what to use it for at the time. So Rockefeller, you had the Vanderbilts, which were a huge railroad family. What's his name? Anderson Cooper on CNN is a Vanderbilt. His mother was part of that fortune. She was an actress, but that's old American money there. And there was others. Mellon, that was in banking. And particularly with guys like Carnegie and Rockefeller, we're talking about Jeff Bezos kind of rich today, if not more so. It was just insane the amount of money that these people were able to, the wealth that these people were managed to collect. In some cases, they were great philanthropists. If you go around the Pittsburgh area, half of the museums and libraries there are named after Carnegie because of the money that he gave to that area. He even though he collected so much wealth, he didn't want to see his children necessarily get rich just off of him. So he did give back quite a bit. So did the other ones. There was a little bit of competition in philanthropy in this day where, creating, charitable organizations and giving back to communities was the thing to do. But we're seeing this divide grow between the lower class and the upper class, and some of that, and we're going to have labor revolution here. We start to see labor movements occurring, unionization, right, organizing, and strikes for better pay, better working conditions, shorter work weeks. This all starts to take place in this time frame. But it's called the Gilded Age because of the money that's accrued by the rich. And it's sort of a luxurious time for them in the United States. It's also a bit of a coming out for the United States. We were, and will continue to be after this time, isolationists, where we, as I mentioned early on, guys like Thomas Jefferson didn't really care about, the rest of the world and what was going on. I probably shouldn't say Thomas Jefferson necessarily, because he was kind of concerned about the French Revolution and sending help to them. But we kept to ourselves. We weren't getting involved in world affairs. Europe was doing Europe, and Asia was doing Asia, and we were just going gangbusters with economic progress. And I should also mention continued territorial expansion. I mean, we had the U.S., but as far as like the migration west and looking for job opportunities in the West, that's continuing. And of course, along with that is the continued sort of subjugation of the American Indian, of the Native Americans, and forcing them onto reservations. But finally, in 1898, right before the turn of the century, America gets involved in a war with Spain over Cuba. So Cuba at this time is fighting for independence. It is still a colony of Spain. It's one of the holdouts in this part of the world. And we had a ship that was in the harbor there. I can't remember the name of it right now, that seemed to possibly be attacked. Later it was found out it might have been like an ammunition explosion on board or a fire on board. But the American media blew that up as an attack by Spain on the United States. So we wind up embroiled in a war where we use largely our Navy, we use Marines and U.S. Army to attack Spanish forces in Cuba. We win. Spain's just not in good shape there to fight a war. Made us look really good, even though we have lots of problems in that war as far as, just tactics and communication and all this stuff. But we win. We wind up with Cuba. And we also later get ceded by Spain the Philippines, where we wind up fighting a war just shortly after the Spanish-American War of 1898. And it begs the question now, as holders of territory that is not part of the United States, are we becoming an empire? And this is something that really clashes with our ideology and our history and our memory, because we are we received our own independence as former subjects of the British Empire. So we set up sort of Cuba as a protectorate and help them work to gain their independence. And eventually they do become their own independent nation and an ally of the United States for a number of years. We'll talk about Cuba when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's a little different story. But it was actually an American playground. The rich would go there. It was a resort town or resort area. People really loved to travel to Cuba. Once again, it's only like 90 miles from Florida. The Philippines is a different story. It becomes a colony, basically, of the United States. It is owned by the United States. So again, this idea, it's like, well, we have always supported autonomy. We've tried to keep out of others' business. And here we are now with territory. I should also mention along the way, we get a little set of islands called Hawaii. That's also basically a colony of the United States until it becomes a state. And to this day, we have territories like Samoa, U.S. Samoa, and the Virgin Islands that are, and Puerto Rico, that are part of the United States, but are not states, and they do not have representation in, in D.C. They have sort of these observing legislators. They can speak and do stuff like that, but they're not allowed to vote on legislation. But the rest of the world kind of notices what's going on in the United States. We build a really fairly powerful Navy at this time. It's still kind of small, but it's really well. It's very modern, and our military is fairly modern, although small. But it is sort of the coming out for the United States. Now, we maintain our neutrality and our sort of isolationist ideas when it comes to things that are happening in Europe. But now the rest of the world is starting to see what's going on in the United States and being like, wow, that might be something we need to worry about down the road, which sort of, because of that fear, makes us grow closer to Europe. Great Britain becomes a little bit of a closer ally. That will come into play when we get to what is World War I. So I think that's actually a good place to stop, because World War I is really, really complicated. But I'll mention as far as things are changing around the world. And just before we stop here, what's going on in Europe at the time that's going to partially lead to this war, and I'll leave it with this, is this idea particularly of nationalism. So you remember back, we talked about the Middle Ages, nobody called themselves French, or British, or German. We didn't think in those terms in those days. You had a local lord, and that was sort of who you're loyal to. Well, by the time we get to the early 1900s, after a long, extensive history of colonialism and economic competition, and the real development of the modern nation state by the 1600s, now people certainly consider themselves British or French or German or Hungarian or what have you. And along with that nationalism, just comes this idea of sort of exceptionalism. We probably heard about American exceptionalism, the idea that we do it better and our way is the best. That's sort of the idea of exceptionalism. Well, that certainly goes along with nationalism, no matter what the country is. There's been recently, some people is like, well, what's wrong with nationalism? But why is that a bad word? Well, in and of itself, not necessarily a bad thing, but every time that comes up, there's horrible things that have been attached with it. And so it's driving competition in Europe. It is also driving the alignment and alliances between a lot of Europe. So, and that's where we'll lead off. We'll talk about that on Monday. We'll get a little more involved with World War I. So from the end of the Civil War through sort of the rest of the 19th century into the early 20th century. So we go from a very broken country with a lot of issues racially, a lot of issues politically that have never quite been resolved in a number of cases, and turning sort of away from solving those issues to our economic problems, wound up making some really rich people along the way that wound up driving some of the labor issues that we would have leaving the 1800s and going into the 1900s. So any questions on Reconstruction or the era that follows, industrialization? Okay, I would mention what I've seen from your social studies test, particularly they like to talk about Reconstruction, particularly the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. There's oftentimes literature and passages on those amendments. We've encountered Frederick Douglass, right? So those are things in particular that you want to make sure that you have sort of a handle on what happened there, what was going on at that time. Plessy versus Ferguson is often something that comes up on the social studies test as well, in other formats that we've worked in other lessons and things too. So anyway, let's go ahead. We'll take about a 10-minute break, and we'll finish off the week with some language arts. All right. All right. I'll see you all at 1:30.